In the distance behind me is Cape Trafalgar, the scene of perhaps one of the world's most decisive naval encounters, in which the Royal Navy, commanded by the legendary Admiral Horatio Nelson, defeated the combined fleets of Napoleonic France and its ally at the time, Spain. The victory cost Nelson his life, but gave him immortality. More than that, the defeat at Trafalgar ended Napoleon's chance of ever crossing the English Channel and attacking Great Britain directly. And this failure led ultimately to Napoleon initiating economic warfare against Great Britain and vice versa. And that's going to be the topic of this lecture. I could go on and on about Napoleon's brilliant military campaigns, but ultimately these failed to produce the final decisive permanent victory that Napoleon craved, but could never quite achieve. In fact, never really came close to achieving. So let me put up the PowerPoint presentation. We'll get started. Here are the terms for really this week's presentation. By the end of this presentation, you should understand why Great Britain and France were unable to defeat one another militarily, the Berlin Decree and Napoleon's imposition of what was called the Continental System, the British Orders in Council as a response to the Continental System, and the progressive encroachment on American maritime rights. And then followed by US attempts to protect their maritime rights through economic sanctions, and the failure of these attempts and the ultimate decision to go to war with Great Britain. It's kind of a beautiful background. I'd love to go to Cape Trafalgar one of these days and have a look. That's just beautiful. Okay. I've already dealt with this, so let's move on. Napoleon's dramatic victories on the battlefield have long exerted a fascination over students of the Napoleonic Wars. Yet the fact remains that these victories, although dramatic, as I have just said, were never final. Indeed, historians keep track of the Napoleonic Wars by counting the coalitions of opposing powers arrayed against him, and which ultimately led to his defeat in 1814. Now, here's a simplified view of the six coalitions. I've omitted minor powers and satellite countries forcibly allied to Napoleonic France. We have the War of the First Coalition, 1792 to 1797, Revolutionary France versus Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and the Dutch Republic. Then we have the War of the Second Coalition, 1798 to 1802. This time Napoleon, who's in power by now, versus Great Britain, Austria, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Portugal, and the United States, in the sense of the quasi-war with France that it waged mostly in Caribbean waters between 1798 and 1800. That was followed by the War of the Third Coalition, 1803 to 1806, Napoleon versus Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden. Then we have the War of the Fourth Coalition, 1806 to 1807. This time Napoleon against Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden. To be followed by the War of the Fifth Coalition, this time Napoleon versus Great Britain and Austria. Then the invasion of Russia, not a coalition, but a pretty good sized invasion. In fact, the greatest army that Napoleon ever assembled was committed to this famously disastrous invasion of Russia. And this involved Russia, but financially supported by Great Britain. Then finally, the War of the Sixth Coalition, 1813 to 1814. Napoleon this time versus Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Spain. And last but not least, in addition, between 1807 and 1814, Napoleon waged an extensive war, which he did not want to wage. It was unending. He called it the Spanish Ulcer. It was the so-called the Peninsula War because it involved Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula. And this Spanish ulcer involved British support for Spanish partisans, and it involved ground operations, military operations in Portugal. Now, despite Napoleon's repeated efforts to gain a permanent victory on land, he proved unable to do so. I think I've made that point convincingly by now. Indeed, these efforts ultimately led to his ruin when the major European powers essentially piled in on him in the War of the Sixth Coalition, which culminated in the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, also called the Battle of the Nations, because the armies of so many great powers were arrayed against Napoleon. The battle was a decisive defeat for Napoleon, forcing him to conduct a fighting retreat back to Paris, where ultimately his own marshals compelled him to abdicate the throne in April 1814. The Battle of Leipzig, by the way, involved 365,000 Allied troops against 195,000 French troops. Allied casualties totaled 54,000. French casualties totaled 79,000. The Battle of Leipzig was far and away the largest battle in Europe until the First World War. Now, let's take another look at that simplified overview of the six coalitions to answer the question, why did Napoleon ultimately turn to the economic warfare that is at the centerpiece of this lecture presentation? Let's take another look at those six coalitions. The War of the First Coalition, Revolutionary France versus Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, Dutch Republic. War of the Second Coalition. I'm not going to, recite the names this time, but you begin to notice a commonality. War of the Third Coalition, War of the Fourth Coalition, War of the Fifth Coalition, War of the Sixth of the invasion of Russia, War of the Sixth Coalition, and that Peninsula War or Spanish Ulcer. Each of these contests, each of these coalitions, plus the Spanish Ulcer, plus the invasion of Russia, has one common element: Great Britain. Great Britain not only fought Napoleon on both land and sea, it used its considerable financial strength to bankroll other nations to fight Napoleon as well. And so Napoleon correctly regarded Great Britain as his nemesis. Let's pause there, give us both a break, and we'll hit this a little bit more after after we both had a break. After I've had lunch, I'm pretty hungry, and after you do whatever it is you do when you're not watching my presentations, which I'm sure are a source of fascination to you.